Hello everybody, and thanks for joining me today for another in the GreyLearning webinar series, another presentation, and once again sponsored by Tamron. Today we are talking about confusion, I suppose. There has been tremendous confusion, it seems, and understandably so, related to Lightroom. We recently saw an announcement about Lightroom and a change in name for another existing version of Lightroom and a change of name for another version of Lightroom, and in the meantime, in the process, we need to figure out what makes the most sense in terms of which product you should be considering for your own workflow now and maybe into the future. So we're going to talk about what all of these announcements really mean, sort of the differences between what is now several different products in the Lightroom family, and hopefully help you make a decision, help you better understand what all of this means, and then determine what that might mean for your workflow now and in the future. So I know some of you already, I see that you are noticing that there is the opportunity for Q&A, and so down at the bottom of your screen you should see, at least if you hover your mouse over, that there is the opportunity to submit questions, so please feel free to do that. And greetings to all of you who have posted through that Q&A. We're getting people from all over the country, and I see all over the world. We've got somebody from Warsaw, Poland here, and a variety of others. So if you've got questions along the way, please feel free to let me know, and I'll do my best to answer as many of those questions as possible. And yes, as always one of the most popular questions is whether or not we will have a recording available. And yes, the recording should be available as soon as this is finished. We'll get that processed and get that posted onto the Tim Gray TV channel on YouTube. So you can take a look there. We'll send a follow-up email as well. So let's go ahead and dive in. Once again, I do want to thank Tamron first and foremost. They've been very generous in helping to make this webinar series happen. And so I certainly want to thank them for that, for their support. And a reminder, this project of sharing photos with the hashtag #WithMyTamron is still ongoing. So if you'd like to share your photos, just use that hashtag. If you share on Instagram, for example, while you're at it, be sure to follow me on Instagram as Tim Gray Photo, and share any photos that you've captured with the Tamron lens using the hashtag #WithMyTamron, and your photo might be selected to be included in a special gallery. All right, oh, and somebody from Greece here as well, so very, very nice. And right off the bat, we have a question about whether or not the Learning Lightroom Mobile course is still going to be true. Yes, I'm going to talk about Lightroom Mobile briefly in just a few moments. And so rest assured, we are going to update the Lightroom Mobile course that's already available in the GreyLearning library, but that will indeed be updated and will reflect, but the basic concepts are all the same. It's just that the application has been updated with new features. So we will address that, certainly. All right, so how did we get into all of this confusion? It seemed so innocuous at first, at least on the surface, that Adobe made an announcement of a brand new product called Lightroom CC. Well, okay, yes, technically it's Photoshop Lightroom CC, but many of us just shorten that a little bit to Lightroom CC. And the immediate response, of course, among many photographers was, wait, what's going on here? Are we in a time warp? Because they're announcing Lightroom CC, and yet Lightroom has been around for about a decade now, and Lightroom CC for, what, at least a few years, something like that. So what is Lightroom CC? Well, Lightroom CC essentially is a brand new platform, and so it does replace, in some respects, the existing Lightroom. It's a completely new product in some respects. It's completely the same in other respects. And so a little bit of confusion, mostly because of this naming issue. So what was Lightroom, well, what was not a product at all became Lightroom CC. And so basically a new product got an existing product name. And so here you can see an image, a screenshot of Lightroom CC, the brand new Lightroom CC, and in many respects, somewhat similar to the Lightroom that we've all known and loved for the last decade, give or take. Well, okay, maybe not everybody loved it, but we've known about it. We have obviously a focus on our photos. We have various panels on the outer edges. Do notice that in Lightroom CC, the new version, the new product, that the photos really take up a lot more of the available space. And so that part I think is interesting. In some ways, I sort of think of the new Lightroom CC as being what Lightroom would have been if it were invented today instead of a decade ago. So more emphasis on the photos. We'll talk about some of the other features here in just a moment. But we have, of course, the ongoing confusion, it would seem, about the name, because Lightroom CC was already a product. Now there's a brand new product called Lightroom CC. Well, I don't like to use the word old in this respect, especially in this particular context, but the application that already existed, that all of us are familiar with, many of us are already using to manage our photos, will now be referred to as Lightroom Classic. To help add more confusion, yes, of course, they're both really Photoshop Lightroom, but again, shortening to just Lightroom and leaving the Photoshop part out of it. And CC is still on the end there. So now we have Lightroom CC as well as Lightroom Classic CC. So first and foremost, the Lightroom that we've been using up until this time, that's now Lightroom Classic CC. I suppose I should hasten to add that this also means that Lightroom is now only a CC product, meaning Creative Cloud, meaning you can no longer purchase Lightroom as a perpetual license. Now, if you want to use Lightroom, it will always be via a subscription. So much like when the Creative Cloud was first announced, however many years ago that's been, 2 or 3 years ago, Photoshop became a subscription-only product. The only way you could get future updates to Photoshop is to subscribe with a monthly or annual plan. Now Lightroom is the same way. So Lightroom Classic is no longer available. Lightroom in any form, I suppose you could say, is no longer available with a perpetual license where you quote-unquote buy the software and have it forever. It was always, of course, a license. You weren't really buying it. You were buying a license to use it. But point being is now it is a monthly subscription product. And then there's been confusion about the fact that there was a Lightroom mobile application, and Lightroom Mobile is now referred to as Lightroom CC. Now, this might seem extra confusing because we took what was Lightroom CC and called it Lightroom Classic CC. We have a new product called Lightroom CC, and then on the mobile devices, we have what was Lightroom Mobile for mobile devices, now is Lightroom CC, the same name as the desktop application. So what is going on? Why do we have two different products on two different platforms that both carry the name Lightroom CC? Well, the answer really is that Lightroom CC is an ecosystem. Lightroom CC is now a single platform, if you will. It is a series of products available as a desktop application, available in your web browser, and available on your mobile devices. So you can use Lightroom CC to manage your photos from virtually anywhere, from virtually any device, provided you have an internet connection, more or less. We'll talk more about the details of that shortly. But Lightroom CC is really just this all-encompassing ecosystem. Now, when I start talking about this with photographers, Lightroom CC can be a desktop app, it can be a mobile app, it can be in the web browser, I immediately hear, well, wait a minute, that's what Lightroom Classic did. We had synchronization to the cloud. We could use Lightroom Mobile to access synchronized collections from our desktop installation of Lightroom, and we could also access those synchronized collections in a web browser. Yes, indeed. That's all very, very true. In many respects, this is something of a duplication, you might say, because Lightroom CC carries over many of the same features: synchronization, web browser access, mobile device access, the ability to manage your photos, the ability to adjust your photos. So in many respects, it is that essentially Adobe is creating a new way of working with your photos. And instead of sort of forcing everyone to adopt that change all at once, they sort of created a fork in the road so that now we have the classic, what I would think of as the primarily desktop version of Lightroom versus the new Lightroom CC ecosystem, which is really a platform for synchronizing your photos, all of your photos, everywhere. So let's talk about that synchronization for just a moment. And this is really, I think this right here represents the most fundamental difference between the new Lightroom CC and the existing, if you will, Lightroom Classic. Synchronization. Lightroom CC synchronizes everything. Every single photo that you add to Lightroom CC will then be synchronized, and in the process, by the way, backed up to the Creative Cloud, to essentially Adobe servers, internet-connected computers floating around somewhere. Every single photo. What that means is now every single photo that you add to Lightroom is available everywhere that you access Lightroom CC. So in my case, for example, my Lightroom Classic catalog contains just shy of 400,000 photos. And so if I were to update that, if you will, if I were to migrate that to Lightroom CC, 400,000 photos, those would all get synchronized to the cloud. And that means that I could borrow your laptop and pull up Lightroom in a web browser, and I could show you all 400,000 of my photos. Or if you run into me on the street and I've got my phone with me, my smartphone with me, I could pull up the Lightroom CC app on my iPhone and I could scroll through 400,000 photos, show you every single photo that I've ever added to Lightroom CC. It might take a while. You might not like all the photos, but you would be able to access everything. And so really at its core, Lightroom CC is about having access to every single photo from virtually anywhere. Lightroom Classic, which I think many of you are probably already familiar with, enables us to synchronize only selected collections. So for example, I tend to travel a lot, and so I'm capturing photos along the way, and hopefully along the way I get some favorite photos. So for example, we just had a weekend photo workshop in New York City. We ran a workshop in Rome, Italy last month. And so during each of those trips or those photo workshops in this case, I might have captured some photos that I like and I want to share with others. Well, in Lightroom Classic, I might create a collection of Rome, Italy favorites. And I would only add to that collection my very favorite photos that I captured in Rome. I would synchronize just that collection, maybe a few other collections, and now I could use Lightroom Mobile, now called Lightroom CC, to make those photos available, to share those photos with anyone I'd like. So the core difference there is that Lightroom Classic is only synchronizing selected collections of photos, while Lightroom CC synchronizes absolutely everything. And so it's mostly a matter of what do you want to have available and how do you want to make it available. And so really, Lightroom CC, again, revolving around this cloud photo service, it's designed for those who want to be able to access their original raw captures from everywhere. They want to be able to get to anything from anywhere. That obviously creates tremendous flexibility in their workflow. It does require, at least, from time to time, a very good internet connection. So I mentioned that I have 400,000 photos in my Lightroom Classic catalog. If I decided to migrate that to Lightroom CC, you can just imagine how long it would take for me to actually be able to get all of that synchronized. I'm guessing weeks, maybe months. I'm not really sure. It depends on your internet speed. When you're traveling, that can obviously be a little bit of a challenge. So this is, again, fundamentally, from a workflow standpoint, this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the new Lightroom CC versus Lightroom Classic is this synchronization. Synchronizing absolutely everything versus synchronizing only those things that you really want to share or make available on the Lightroom CC on your mobile device or Lightroom in a web browser. And I should add, by the way, that Lightroom CC now on a mobile device, that version of Lightroom for mobile devices can be used with either the Lightroom CC app or with Lightroom Classic. So regardless of what you're using on the desktop, you can still access your photos with the Lightroom CC mobile application or through the web browser. It's just a question of what the source of images might be. So let's talk about some of the other fundamental differences between Lightroom CC and Lightroom Classic. This one you might find interesting. Lightroom CC has no folders whatsoever. Well, okay, there's folders in the background, but you don't get access to folders. As far as you're concerned, folders don't exist. Because when you add photos to Lightroom CC, there will be a date-based folder structure created for all of that synchronization. You have no control over that. Instead, you would use albums, which essentially, for those of you familiar with collections in the existing version of Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, albums are the same feature by a different name. And so I can browse all of my photos. I can browse photos that were recently added to Lightroom CC. I could browse by date. I also can create albums. So you see here, for example, a couple of screenshots showing some of the albums. I have an album of favorite images from Antarctica, favorite images from Italy this year, favorite images from New York City this year. I have a slideshow group there, which probably contains several other albums. And so I can create albums to help me organize my photos in any way I'd like. So when I'm adding photos to Lightroom CC, I might create an album essentially for any photos that I add. And so presumably then I might, for me personally, have an album on a per photo trip basis. In other words, anytime I might use a folder with Lightroom Classic, in Lightroom CC I might create an album instead. But still an important distinction to be aware of, that there are no folders as far as you're concerned inside of Lightroom CC. Instead, you'll just be browsing sort of everything. So as we're talking about these distinctions, Carolyn's got a question here. What about using both Lightroom CC as well as Lightroom Classic? The short answer that I would give is don't. Do not. You need to choose one or the other. Conceptually, yes, there is some synchronization that happens between both versions. It is possible. As I mentioned, you're able with either Lightroom CC or Lightroom Classic to access your photos via Lightroom on a mobile device or Lightroom in a web browser, but they're taking a very different approach. And so the short answer really is just you need to make a choice. You need to choose one or the other. And I'll talk more about that choice shortly. All right, another distinction is that we can have, in Lightroom Classic, we still have available to us a map module. Now, in fairness, if you are capturing photos with GPS coordinates embedded in them, Lightroom CC, the new software, will still show you in the information panel, it will still show you what I would refer to as a thumbnail version of the map of where that photo was captured, but it's not an interactive map the way we have in the map module in Lightroom Classic. However, you can at any time click on that map representation in the new Lightroom CC, and that will launch Google Maps in a web browser. So you have similar capabilities, but not quite the same. And so for me personally, most of my photography is done while traveling. Most of my photography, in some ways, connects to the location that I'm visiting, the place where I'm photographing. And so for me, the map module is a really big deal, something that I really, really am happy to have. And so that is, for me, a big advantage of Lightroom Classic as compared to Lightroom CC. And then also Lightroom CC is currently missing some adjustments. So for example, you're not able to create HDR or panorama images, composite panoramas, in Lightroom CC. You are able to apply many of the adjustments, but there are some adjustments that are still missing. That will change over time. Adobe has indicated that one of their goals is to have essentially parity in the adjustments between Lightroom Classic, Lightroom CC, and Adobe Camera Raw. But in the short term, there are a handful of adjustments that are missing. The adjustments themselves have changed somewhat in terms of how they're organized, but the basic adjustments that we're all familiar with are already there. So optics and geometry for lens corrections, for example, profile-based corrections, we can still sharpen and apply noise reduction. So we've got the most important adjustments, but not everything. There is cropping and image cleanup. There's targeted adjustments by way of a radial or a painting, an adjustment brush, etc. But it's not 100% just yet. Another interesting aspect of Lightroom CC is that there's no modules. There are no modules at all. So when we're in Lightroom Classic, we're switching between applications essentially in terms of switching modules. So we're in the library module where we're the application, the context there would be organizing our photos versus optimizing the appearance of our photos. Whereas in Lightroom CC, it's essentially just sort of seamless. So I'll switch over here to Lightroom CC and we'll just take a look at any old picture here. Let's have a look. Well, what have we got? Something interesting. Oh, a crop duster. And so if I open up a photo, then I'm able to browse that photo. I can see information about the photo. So here's the map representation that I was referring to. And then I can just seamlessly switch to browsing different photos altogether. So here's the collections that you saw, the albums now in the parlance of Lightroom CC that we saw previously. And then if I want to apply any adjustments, those are just available over here on the right panel at any given moment. And so while I don't have all of the adjustments, so for example, the ability to apply split toning is not available right now in Lightroom CC, you'll notice that the experience is a little bit more seamless. And I would certainly call that a good thing in that I'm able to manage and optimize and share my photos all from a single place, so that I don't have this kind of switching and getting different previews and dealing with all of these things that are a little cumbersome, I would admit, in Lightroom Classic. One of, I think, the most interesting things about Lightroom CC, and a feature that I certainly hope that Adobe will add to Lightroom Classic. We've seen these issues, right, where a feature that is available in one product is not available elsewhere. So for example, the content-aware cleanup that's available in Photoshop but not in Lightroom. These sorts of issues can be a little bit of a challenge, a frustration perhaps. And so we have this image analysis capability in Lightroom CC that is currently not available in Lightroom Classic. I have no idea whether or not that might get changed, if Adobe will see fit to add that capability later. But this is a really, really interesting element. So I'm going to make sure that I'm browsing all photos here. I am. And so I can filter my images by, star ratings or based on keywords or locations where I captured the images, in this case all based on GPS coordinates that my camera recorded. But I can also search for a variety of other things. So, for example, what might I want to search? Well, you saw that I had searched for a horse, for example, in the screenshot that we were just looking at. And so if I type horse, sure enough, Lightroom finds pictures of horses. I did not add keywords. Well, I should make sure that that's true. That is true. I did not add any keywords at all to this photo, and yet Lightroom is able to find pictures of a horse and pictures of mountains, for example. And here we have some photos of mountains you can see very quickly and easily. I could mix and match, certainly, so I could search for a particular subject. Let's go find a hang glider, and then use star ratings, for example, to further kind of filter down those images to reduce the number of, essentially, search results. And one of the things that's really interesting about this image analysis is that it will actually get better over time, because Lightroom is using this image analysis on the servers. Well, that gets to be updated on a regular basis, and so they can correct little flaws and add new search terms based on their image analysis. This could turn into something incredibly interesting. Imagine a world where this capability gets to be so strong. I'm going to try and find Rome sunset. Let's see how that works. There's one I've not tested yet. And yet here we are. So there's St. Peter's Basilica just after sunset, and we have down at the bottom here, we have late afternoon light. Also at, this is from Castel San Angelo, so in the heart of Rome. And then we have, whoops, not a sunset, that's a moonrise, but we certainly could understand why that would create confusion. But theoretically, keywording becomes something of the past, where it's not necessary, because Lightroom CC is able to see our GPS coordinates if you have a camera that's so equipped, the time of day, the subject matter. It's able to analyze the actual contents of the image. That could be very, very interesting in terms of, in theory, never having to keyword your images again, and yet having all of that capability just as though you had indeed assigned keywords. One thing that's in Lightroom Classic but not in Lightroom CC is face recognition. And so if you have a tendency to photograph people, this might be something that is a concern, an issue for you. If you're making use of the face feature in Lightroom Classic, that would be yet another reason that Lightroom Classic might be a good fit for you. What a lot of this sort of amounts to is that, in my mind, the way I think of this is that Lightroom CC is very much a 1.0 product. It is the first release of this new platform. And so we'll talk more about that in the context of making your decision, but it does mean that there are some technologies there that are new and fresh and interesting. It also means there are some features that are missing. If we think back to when Lightroom was first announced and all the different features that were not there at the time that are there now, it was relatively recently, all things considered, that we started being able to assemble HDR images inside of Lightroom, for example, or composite panoramas. So those are features that were added relatively recently to Lightroom Classic. They've not yet been added to the new Lightroom CC. I'm sure that they will. So we have a question here whether Moonrise would work. And that's a really good question. I've not yet performed every search imaginable, so would Moonrise be one word? Let's find out. Let's see how it does. Actually, so yes, to answer your question, in real time with an experiment, yes, indeed, it does work. I don't even know would it support that with 2 words? Does it know? No, so here's our black hole message. That did not yield any results at all. So you can have all sorts of fun with this, of course, looking for images. I think I had even searched for Basilica at one point, and sure enough, not 100% accurate, but it did a pretty good job of spotting photos of, in this case, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So an interesting capability, something that, it's not always going to be 100%. We saw, sunset, it found a moonrise photo, etc. But still, a very clever capability that, as it continues to get better and better, certainly I'm very happy about that possibility from the standpoint of not really wanting to have to keyword all of my photos. But we also need to make sure that the software is able to find what we need when we need it. And so, for me, this notion of being able to search based on the contents of the photo is wildly interesting, very, very compelling. Conceptually, you might be familiar, there's a bit of overlap here with Photoshop Elements. The Elements Organizer includes the ability, this image analysis. It's been there for a couple versions already. And so there's very much an overlap, but we have this potential to now be able to find. Remember, the camera, my camera at least, has a GPS receiver, knows a location. It knows the time of day. And so now, even without keywords, thanks to the image analysis, we're actually able to find images. So conceptually, as the software gets smarter and smarter, it is possible that we would be able to actually locate photos very easily without actually having to add keywords ever again, which I think is so wonderful. There was a question, could we add keywords if we wanted to? So let's go, we'll go find that sunset that's not really a sunset. Well, now it's finding lots of sunsets. Oh no, it was Rome sunset was what I had searched for. So Rome sunset. And so now it's finding images that presumably are from Rome based on GPS coordinates, but this is actually a moonrise. So the question was, could I add keywords still? one of the questions here was whether or not we could still add keywords, and the answer is yes. So here's several photos, for example, and then I can go into my keyword tags, and in this case I'd already added Italy, Rome, moon, and moonrise, and so maybe I'll just add twilight as a keyword as well for those images. And so yes, by all means, you can add your own keywords. If I just go, randomly find an image, I'll switch to my photo grid view here. Here's an image of a leaf, and so I could go into my keywords, and with that image selected, add leaf as a keyword, for example. And so then that would be included as part of that search capability. So rather interesting. In terms of the GPS coordinates, so there's a question here about adding information. So if you have a camera that does not include a GPS receiver, then how would you add? So we have our map view here inside of Lightroom CC. Inside of Lightroom, this is one of the reasons that I like having the map module, is to be able to actually drag photos onto the map in Lightroom Classic. And so you can add that into the GPS metadata, but much, much easier to do, I would say, inside of Lightroom Classic. So one of those advantages of using Lightroom Classic. And I see the question here in terms of multi-select. So I'm here within, this was one of the big issues of using Lightroom Classic. It's still an issue, the loop view versus the grid view. And so some of you may have noticed, obviously one of you noticed at least, about this multi-select in Lightroom CC. Now when I select multiple photos, I can update the information for multiple photos. I no longer need to switch to the loop view, the detail view, versus the grid view when I'm working. So in Lightroom Classic, if I want to add photos, if I'm working within this detail view, if I want to add information to these photos, I would need to switch to the grid view in order to add keywords, for example, to multiple photos. But in Lightroom CC, that's no longer the case. So I can add lighthouse as a keyword, and that has been applied to all of these selected images. So that little caveat of working with multiple images in Lightroom Classic is no longer an issue in Lightroom CC. So that certainly is a nice update. So we talked about the synchronization, and again, that really is, I would say, the core difference between the new Lightroom CC and what is now Lightroom Classic. And some of this relates then to the pricing. And that too, I would say, gets a little bit confusing. So if you're trying to make a decision of what to buy on the Adobe website, I would say that it's a little bit confusing. But Lightroom CC, the brand new ecosystem that has gotten us all to come together and talk about this today, is $9.99 per month. Remember, that's synchronizing absolutely everything. Every single photo. It includes 1 terabyte of storage. So if you go beyond that, you're also then going to pay, at the moment, another $9.99 per month per terabyte. Now, I mentioned that I have about 400,000 photos in my Lightroom Classic catalog. That represents, I have to go take a second look and make sure, but it's somewhere around 5 terabytes. It might even be close to 6 terabytes of storage. That means about $50 or $60 a month for me to use Lightroom CC. So I'm hoping that Adobe will come up with some sort of volume discount in terms of how they're structuring the pricing for storage, because $50 or $60 a month, suddenly, many of you who know me, who've been following me for a while, know that my tendency is to not delete photos. Suddenly, if I were using Lightroom CC, where it synchronizes everything, I would start giving some thought to maybe I need to start deleting my outtakes because I'm paying for all of that storage. Not that I want to delete 4 terabytes of photos just to get back down to $10 a month, but something to think about. And hopefully, again, I really hope that Adobe will revisit this pricing and give us some sort of, volume discount for more storage, for example. To me, Lightroom CC as it stands today is a little bit more for kind of, an entry-level photographer is not really the right way to think about this, because it's really not about skill level or whether or not you're commercial or not as a photographer. It's more about workflow, but still, to have all your photos everywhere, that's a significant premium, I would argue. And that plan does not include Photoshop. You can get Photoshop as a standalone product, an individual app, but at that point you might want the complete collection, which is $50 a month. But again, there's a number of variables there depending on which software you actually need. Photoshop is not included at that base price. However, you can also opt for Lightroom Classic, and this is not exactly the right way to describe this. This is where things get a little bit confusing, because if you prefer to use Lightroom Classic, you get the photography plan for $10 a month. That includes only 20 gigabytes of storage. But remember, with Lightroom Classic, theoretically at least, you're only using that synchronization feature for selected collections. And so, in theory, that 20 gigabytes will be plenty. If you want a terabyte, that takes you up to $20 a month, $19.99 a month. So if you opt for the photography plan, what really is happening, so this is where things get a little messy, is it's not really Lightroom Classic versus Lightroom CC. It's that you can choose Lightroom Classic or Lightroom CC. So in theory, if Lightroom CC worked fine for you with a limit of only 20 gigabytes, then you can spend $10 a month, get Lightroom Classic or CC, so you could opt for whichever you want, and you get Photoshop included. As I mentioned before, it's only a subscription. You can no longer get Lightroom Classic as a standalone product without a subscription fee. So with this plan, the variables make it very confusing, of course. But the idea is that if you want access to Photoshop, you could go with this $20 a month plan, opt for Lightroom CC or Lightroom Classic, and that was actually a question earlier, was whether or not Photoshop fits in with Lightroom CC. You can still send photos to Photoshop from Lightroom CC. It's just that the baseline Lightroom CC subscription does not include Photoshop, but if you go up to $20 a month, you could use Lightroom CC with Photoshop with that terabyte of storage at $20 a month rather than $10. Or if you're a Lightroom Classic user, then you could opt for $20 a month if you want the 1 terabyte. So the short answer is, if you're under a terabyte and you want to use Lightroom CC, $10 a month. If you're preferring to use Lightroom Classic and you're okay with only 20 gigabytes of online storage because you're only synchronizing maybe a small portion of your catalog, then you can still get that for $10 a month. So a little bit of confusion there. Photoshop is still included with the Lightroom Classic plan, but again, you've got that storage limitation. So for those of you that want Lightroom CC, you probably want to spend the $20 a month to get Photoshop, I suspect, and that still includes 1 terabyte, still a $10 charge per month for each additional terabyte. But in any event, that is the basic pricing structure. So then the question is, how do you choose? How do you make a decision between Lightroom Classic and Lightroom CC? I know some of you probably are already saying, well, it's easy, I'm just sticking with Lightroom Classic, but number one is that you should absolutely choose only one. Even though the photography plan gives you access to Lightroom Classic and Lightroom CC, you should treat that as Lightroom Classic or Lightroom CC. If you try to use both, I promise you, you're going to make a mess of things. So you'll need to choose one or the other. If you're already using Lightroom Classic, if you already have a workflow that revolves around Lightroom Classic, I highly recommend that you keep using Lightroom Classic. That you don't even worry about the fact that Lightroom CC has been announced. Except, if it looks interesting, take a closer look. Hopefully, this webinar presentation today helps you get a better sense of Lightroom CC, but then maybe take a look at a trial version of Lightroom CC with a test group of images. So for example, if you're on the photography plan, you have access to Lightroom CC, you're just limited to 20 gigabytes, make a copy of some of your images, bring them into Lightroom CC and get a feel for it and see if it might be of use. But bear in mind that it might not be ready for your needs just yet. It doesn't have all the features that you might be familiar with Lightroom Classic. Some of the features that you need. Sharing is very minimal thus far in Lightroom CC, for example. And so you'll want to take that into account as well. Maybe in the future, Lightroom CC will be great for you so that you have all of your photos available from everywhere. And you've got this incredible image analysis capability, making it easier for you to find your photos, but it might not be quite ready for you today. And then perhaps the biggest challenge is to consider your data transfer and storage needs. So I have something like 5 or 6 terabytes of photos in Lightroom Classic. Do I really want to spend $50 or $60 a month as compared to the $10 a month I could be spending right now in order to have Lightroom CC versus Lightroom Classic? For me, that is a pretty easy decision. I'm going to stick with Lightroom Classic. And if you don't like subscriptions, you're going to have to look somewhere else altogether. Now, somewhere else altogether just means not Lightroom. You could still look at Photoshop Elements as a potential solution, or start looking at other software tools out there, because Lightroom, as I mentioned, is no longer available as a standalone non-subscription product. So maybe a little bit obvious, but what am I doing? I think perhaps it's become tremendously obvious. I'm sticking with Lightroom Classic. I'm keeping an eye on Lightroom CC. I'm hoping that the image analysis capabilities of Lightroom CC will migrate over to Lightroom Classic. I have no idea whether or not that might happen at any time in the future, and if so, how long we might have to wait. But this could be interesting as things sort of transition, and to see what Adobe does. Naturally, as soon as the announcement was made, many photographers expressed the concern, is Adobe going to be getting rid of? Are they going to be getting rid of Lightroom Classic? So far, the answer is no, but I would not be surprised if, as things evolve, that the new Lightroom CC is sort of just going to replace Lightroom Classic. You can see there's already tremendous overlap, and so the real question is, will this fork in the road continue to represent two paths in terms of workflow, or are we going to see a transition? The analogy, I suppose, would be that you were able to get Lightroom as a standalone product. Now it's only subscription. So it started as an option where you could have it either way, and then that transitioned. Now it's only available as a subscription. So will we also see something similar where Lightroom Classic just sort of fades away? I hope not. But if Lightroom CC is updated, so for example, if Lightroom CC would add the ability to selectively synchronize. I want to synchronize these photos, but not those photos. I only want to synchronize images that have a star rating assigned, for example. That would make Lightroom CC that much more interesting to me. So let's take a look at some of the questions that we've gotten here today. First off, thanks for joining. And if you have questions, do feel free to put those into the Q&A field there, and I'll try to address as many of these as I possibly can. So Tom asks if it's difficult to migrate photos from Lightroom Classic to Lightroom CC. No, it's remarkably easy. You can simply migrate your existing Lightroom Classic catalog into Lightroom CC, and so you've got all of your details, your star ratings, your keywords, and all of that metadata available. And so I think that for those who feel that the new Lightroom CC is a great solution, I would strongly suggest testing it out a little bit first, and then once you've decided that it is the right tool for you, then yes, absolutely, it's very easy to migrate your Lightroom Classic catalog into Lightroom CC. So perhaps a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek question here. Are companies like MacFun and DxO thrilled about all of this? MacFun, by the way, changed their name last week to Skyloom, but I suspect that they might be happy about this because, yes, it does create a little bit of confusion, and it gives them a good opportunity. So anytime we have this kind of change in strategy, it opens up new opportunities, and one of the things that I love to see is when software companies try to compete, try to come out with better solutions, and there are a variety of solutions out there from other companies. Alien Skin Software has come up with some great tools. Many photographers still using Photo Mechanic. MacFun has now become Skyloom, and they've got some great tools out there. DxO, etc. The list goes on. There are many, many options there in terms of other solutions, other software. So it'll be interesting to see how that transitions. So great question from John about local versus cloud storage in the new Lightroom CC. And so when you hear people talking about Lightroom CC, you might say, wait a minute, if I've got a slow internet connection, how am I ever going to get any work done? Because I add photos and now it's going to take forever to synchronize and I can't get my work done. And what if I don't have an internet connection, which happens plenty of time? Well, you're still adding photos locally and then they're synchronizing to the cloud. And so you can still work with the local copies while the synchronization is happening in the background, or you can actually pause the synchronization if you don't want to synchronize temporarily, and then still have access to the local copies of your photos. And in fact, Lightroom CC has the option to store every single photo locally. The default is that everything goes to the cloud. Now get this might sound scary initially, but by default, Lightroom CC synchronizes everything to the cloud, backs up everything in the cloud, and then to make more hard drive space available on your computer, will delete the local copies of your photos until you need them again. Then they'll be downloaded from the cloud. There's the issue, obviously, in terms of online access. How often are you online? How often do you find yourself with a slow or non-existent internet connection? That certainly is a concern when it comes to Lightroom CC, but it does create this new possibility of essentially not even really storing most of your photos locally and instead relying upon the cloud. And then, one of the questions that I saw earlier as well was whether or not you can delete photos or how you delete photos and what happens. So if you have deleted photos, if you want to delete a photo in Lightroom CC, in fact, I can show you that real quickly. If I switch over to Lightroom CC here and I decide that I want to delete a photo, I can right-click and choose to delete the photo, but notice the dialog that appears. If I delete, I'm deleting the photo from my local library. I'm deleting from all synchronized devices, my smartphone, my web browser, all my shared galleries. In other words, this photo, if I delete it, it is going to cease to exist. I'm not just saying delete it off my hard drive but keep it in the cloud, or delete it from the cloud but keep it on my hard drive. I'm saying make this photo completely disappear from everywhere. And so this, for many photographers, is a notion that will be uncomfortable. That is not something that you're probably going to be entirely comfortable with doing. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that, because there are many photographers who delete their outtakes and don't even think twice about it. But when it comes to Lightroom CC, again, you're really embracing this cloud-focused storage. You are working in a scenario where by default, as I mentioned, all your photos are in the cloud and they may or may not be locally on your computer right now. You might need to have internet access to access some of your photos. And so that certainly is something to keep in mind if you're considering Lightroom CC and you've been using Lightroom Classic. So you're saying Lightroom CC will store both a catalog and image folders. So yes, in Lightroom CC, it's very similar in concept to having local storage, a local catalog so that you can view your photos even when they're offline, meaning even when your computer's offline, and then you have this added feature of synchronization for everything, but you still have local photos. So you still have this ability to work with your photos directly in Lightroom CC, even when the source photos are not necessarily available. So we still have that basic capability. Think of Lightroom CC as Lightroom Classic, but with synchronization for everything. And that really means that you still can work locally, again, depending on your specific settings. So let's see, take a look at some of the other questions. If you have if you've got more than one computer, this is where Lightroom CC starts to look a lot more interesting. So if you're traveling with one computer, you've got a different computer at home, that's the type of workflow where Lightroom CC looks a lot more interesting. And so that with time, I think Lightroom CC will become a better solution for photographers, because now you're synchronizing absolutely everything everywhere, available from multiple computers, from multiple devices, from a web browser, whereas Lightroom Classic, you have that catalog and you don't have as easy an ability to work on different computers. And this is an issue that some photographers have tried to solve with the use of like Dropbox or some other service to store your Lightroom catalog. That has some risks, to be sure, but Lightroom CC potentially makes it a lot easier to work from any computer, any device, anywhere, as long as you have an internet connection so that everything can synchronize. After the initial sync, how do you add additional photos? So we have Lightroom CC here. Within Lightroom CC, you can see that plus button up here, and we just simply add. And so, for example, I'm not sure if I even have any photos on my iPhone right now, but it is connected. So I can add from my iPhone, and notice that all I'm doing is importing from my phone, choosing which album I want to add these photos to, selecting all of the images, and then adding the photos. So the import process is incredibly simple. I don't have any photos on my iPhone. That's why it's just spinning there looking and looking and looking. I'll just cancel that. But we can add from existing folders. We can add from other devices. You can import from your media cards, etc. And so we do have this very streamlined workflow for the control freaks among us. That maybe is not the best solution just yet. But again, this is... the notion of folders versus not having folders, it's an interesting consideration because conceptually folders are not really physical, tangible things either. A folder is almost like a keyword. And so in theory then we don't really need to have folders. They're an arbitrary construct. But number one, many of us have gotten comfortable working with folders and we like having folders. And number two, what about when I decide that Lightroom CC is no longer a good solution for me and I want to go use some other piece of software? Then what? And that could be a real challenge because now, first of all, I might need to download everything from the internet again, which could be terabytes of data potentially that I need to download to my computer. And the folder structure is no longer going to be a folder structure I defined. It's going to be just a date-based folder structure. Suddenly using other software becomes a real challenge. If I never added any keywords because I'm using Lightroom CC's image analysis feature, now I have no keywords available in my other software. So certainly some really big challenges potentially. It really represents a commitment, which I suppose is exactly what Adobe wants, is for you to keep paying your subscription fee month after month forever. But again, you need to think about what this overall workflow means for you and what the long-term consequences are. If you adopt Lightroom CC and a few years from now decide you're going to use completely different software, you may have a very serious challenge migrating that workflow. One of the other questions, I mentioned that sharing was fairly limited. I've just popped up here. You can see that I can save, essentially export the photo or send it to Facebook. The question specifically was whether there was a slideshow module here in the desktop app. No, there is not. Obviously, you can present your images in a sort of slideshow type of presentation on the mobile version, but not available directly inside the desktop application. I suspect that that will change over time. So no slideshow feature, at least right now. Really interesting question. Murray asks if I see tablets being a viable option, eliminating the laptop desktop. And I think this really gets to one of the notions that Adobe must be thinking about, is bearing in mind I can add photos into Lightroom CC. I just showed you here on the desktop, but I can also add photos on my mobile device. So iPhone images, for example, I can capture and have add to Lightroom CC instantly, the moment I take the picture. If you're capturing images on your tablet, or if you're downloading photos to your tablet, and then they synchronize to the cloud, suddenly, if you think about this, and we talk about photos as if we absolutely positively need them stored locally. I mean, that's how I feel. But what about email? I'm very dependent on email, but I don't really have email on my computer. It's all sitting on a server somewhere, being backed up hopefully by that company, whoever's email provider, whichever email provider I'm using. So we've gotten comfortable with that with email. Is it possible that someday we'll get comfortable with that with our photos, that everything just goes up, our internet connection is fast and reliable, and every photo just gets copied, backed up to the cloud? Then maybe, for those of you who are comfortable with that idea, Lightroom CC might be a good solution sooner rather than later. There's a question about if you're wanting to incorporate Photoshop, which is the right tool, Lightroom Classic versus Lightroom CC? And I would say that you can absolutely work with Lightroom CC or Lightroom Classic and still have Photoshop as part of your workflow. So as I mentioned, the pricing, then we can work with Photoshop in either case. It's a different pricing plan, of course. But so Lightroom CC, the baseline plan does not include Photoshop, but for an extra $10 a month, essentially, you can include Photoshop in that. And so the use of Photoshop would not really be part of your decision-making process. You would instead want to think about that overall workflow. In either case, Photoshop is available. Lightroom Classic only stores the preview in the cloud. Yes, sort of, in a manner of speaking. So with Lightroom CC, we are synchronizing our original captures, so your raw captures, your video cap, whatever the files might be, all of those are being synchronized to the cloud. In Lightroom Classic, what's being synchronized is actually a DNG copy at a, generally speaking, lower resolution. The size, it's somewhere in the vicinity of 2,500 pixels on the long edge as an Adobe DNG file. So in a manner of speaking, you could say, yes, it's really more of a preview. It's just a good high quality preview that's being synchronized with Lightroom Classic. Whereas with Lightroom CC, you literally have access to your original raw captures from anywhere, which could certainly be interesting. As you upload, are you uploading to an album, or do you create albums after uploading or downloading? So when you add photos to Lightroom CC, you have the option to create an album as part of that process, or to select an existing album so that all of the photos you're adding, so for example, I take a trip to Italy, I download some photos during that trip, they go into an Italy album. When I download additional photos, I also put them into the Italy album. Not required, but definitely recommended to help you keep your photos organized right from the start. But then, of course, as you're working with your photos in other ways, you're making a slideshow, or you're, whatever it is that you want to do, then you could create additional albums. So I do recommend adding photos into Lightroom CC and adding them to an album as part of that process, but you could also very easily add photos to albums later. Really good question here. How does Mylio compare to Lightroom CC for cloud storage? And I would say very, very similar in general. Mylio is a product that came out a few years ago, I believe it was, and that actually is quite similar in many respects to Lightroom CC in terms of synchronizing all of your photos to the cloud. I would have to take a closer look at the pricing structure. I know Mylio had an upper limit on overall storage capacity that was available, and so that was a limitation for many photographers. Price-wise, I'm not sure how that necessarily compared. I'd have to take another look at that. My impression is that Mylio has not attracted a significant number of users. It doesn't seem like it's in very common use, so I'm not sure what the status is there overall. And let's see here, new features in Lightroom Classic. Will there be tutorials available? Yes, of course. We are working on updates to the GreyLearning video courses related to what is now Lightroom Classic, so look for some updates there in the coming weeks. And let's see here. Take a look at some of these other questions. So if you inadvertently downloaded Lightroom CC as opposed to Lightroom Classic, you can uninstall the application, certainly. Just bear in mind that there might still be synchronized photos, so you'd want to take that into account as well. And let's see. Okay, so that we addressed how we add additional photos. A good question, can you also copy your photos to a backup drive during that import? So in Lightroom Classic, we have the ability to copy photos to a second location. In Lightroom CC, that is not an option. And so you would be taking your photos, for example, from your memory card to your computer as an interim step, you might say. Then those photos are getting synchronized to the cloud. That is, of course, partially a backup process. But as far as a local backup, no, you would need to use a different product. So, for example, if you were an Apple user, you might use Time Machine to back up your computer, or you could create a backup of the location, the location where you've stored your photos. So in Lightroom CC, you can specify what you want that primary storage location to be for local storage. And you could then, of course, back up that location to make sure that you've got an additional backup copy. So you don't have a local backup available when it comes to actually being able to create a backup instantly, so to speak. So you'd have to do that outside of Lightroom CC, whereas in Lightroom Classic, it is still an option to create a copy in a second location. So sort of a philosophical question here from Skip as far as what I think generally about the subscription model. And, the question here is partly what motivated it. And I think that's pretty straightforward. What motivated the subscription model was ongoing revenue. In terms of having you paying a monthly subscription fee that you're sort of locked into, as opposed to hoping that, in this case, Adobe could convince you to upgrade when a major release comes out every, year and a half or 2 years or what have you. And so part of that obviously is revenue. In fairness, though, the upshot is now we have ongoing updates. Recently, many of you might be aware, the Lightroom Classic update. So when Lightroom on the desktop became Lightroom Classic, that update actually focused, not exclusively, but significant amount of focus on performance. And there were a handful of performance areas that really made a significant improvement. There were performance improvements that are very, very significant. And so in the old world, I believe, where we had a perpetual license, if Adobe came out with an update to Lightroom that only improved performance, I think that the sales of that update would be very minimal. That as much as we might talk about wanting performance improvements, that we're not going to pay, $200 for an update that just speeds things up a bit. Whereas now, Adobe has that flexibility to be able to focus on performance updates periodically to improve the product. There have actually been more feature updates since Adobe switched to the Creative Cloud subscription model than there had been before in terms of feature counts. And so in many respects, it is a good thing. But obviously, I would say the motivation, I suspect, had to have been revenue first and foremost. It's a different approach to software licensing than we had been familiar with previously. It's, a change, whether or not it's a good thing, it really, really depends. Personally, sure, if I could have the software at a fixed price and it's just available forever, that's great. But also keeping in mind that the initial cost. So for example, with the Creative Cloud subscription, you can gain access to essentially every single Adobe application for $50 a month, starting at $50 for your first month, instead of having to come up with, potentially hundreds or, a couple $1,000s for the full collection. So I would say that, it's not altogether a bad thing. It's just a different thing, but we'll see. So nesting of albums, yes, we can nest albums within Lightroom CC. And so we can have, these groups of albums, for example, that create that nesting capability. Is Lightroom CC mobile still available? Yes, it's just been renamed to Lightroom CC, so you can still find the mobile version. It still is able to synchronize with either Lightroom CC or Lightroom Classic, but it's still available for Android and for iPhones, iPads, all those types of devices. Most mobile devices, in other words. How do you make a folder of images in Lightroom CC? You do not. So you would create an album instead, which is it's the same concept as a collection in Lightroom Classic. So let's see. Time for well, we're over time, I suppose. Let's see if we've got some other questions here that we can try and finish up with. If I stop my subscription in a year or two, how do I retrieve all of my cloud-based images? You would then want to enable the option in Lightroom CC. Well, there are several ways you could go about this, but what I would do is just turn on the option to store a copy locally and let it synchronize, wait for that process to finish, and then once that process is finished, then you would be able to discontinue your subscription. Or if you start out with that option enabled, then that would be another capability as well in terms of storing locally. Just keep in mind that you're not controlling the folder structure, you're not saving out all that metadata to those photos, and so there is an element of Lightroom CC sort of locking you in a little bit, and so there is that potential issue of kind of having a difficult, just go talk to any photographer who is using Apple's Aperture. It was a painful experience to try to then switch to other software. So that same sort of issue is going to exist with Lightroom CC, and so you want to give some careful thought to your workflow structure, how you're going to approach that. And one of the topics that I've addressed over the years has been this notion of kind of independence from Lightroom, not being dependent on the catalog. So I save my metadata out to the files, I define my own folder structure. Lightroom CC does away with that. And so the notion of spending $10, $50, $60, $100 a month forever just to continue managing my existing photos, admittedly, that doesn't have a strong appeal to me. But then are the other features available? So certainly there are some things that need to sort of be taken into account. What I would like to see is the ability to have an exit strategy built into Lightroom CC. The problem is, of course, Adobe is incentivized to not provide you with an exit strategy because they want you to just keep paying on an ongoing basis. So certainly some challenges. As I mentioned, I certainly think that in the short term it makes sense to continue using Lightroom Classic if you're already a Lightroom Classic user. And if you're not using Lightroom Classic, then you might consider whether or not Lightroom CC makes sense for you, for your workflow. And of course, keep in mind, there are a variety of other solutions out there as well that you might want to take a look at so that you're making a more informed decision about what strategy for your workflow might make the most sense. So we're a little out of time today. If you do have follow-up questions, I have missed a few of the questions here. By all means, please feel free to send those to me via email, and I'll try to respond to as many of those as I can, or perhaps we'll cover those in a future webinar presentation as well. In the meantime, thank you again for joining us today, and special thanks to Tamron for making the GreyLearning webinar series possible. And all of you will hope to see you again on a future webinar presentation. Thanks very much for joining today.